Hey, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Dentistry Unmasked. My name is David Rice, and I'm here again with.
Hello, Pamela Maragliano-Muniz. This is funny. This is like a blast from the past, this episode, but it is, but it isn't because our guest, Dave Miller, I've known for now over 10 years. Not that we've kept in touch the entire time, but Dave helped me buy my practice back in the day.
That's right. That's
Really?
right. A little trip down
So
memory lane here.
Oh,
yeah, so
wow.
welcome. I'm so glad. So back in the day, Dave was with a very large banking institution, and they were kind enough to loan me money so I could buy my practice. So thank you. But I also want to hear what you're up to now. Like, where have you been? What you doing?
Yeah, so since that time, I've had been in the dental industry in a couple different capacities, but currently running the transition group for Rosen Dental Transitions, which is affiliated with Rosen and Associates, an accounting firm here, where we help practice owners sell their practice, and um, we like to say we're buyer agnostic. So I think there's so much talk about DSOs and corporate, and we try and really help doctors understand that there's a place for DSOs. I'm not saying that you should never sell, but you can really choose your own adventure, as cheesy as that sounds now. And so it's a lot of having a plan and talking about what you really want to help practice owners transition the way they want to, not the way their friends did or what they think they have to do because of what they hear in the on Twitter or from different dental boards. So
True story. And I agree. I think there's maybe not a right or a wrong, but there's probably a best scenario for everybody based on where they've been, what their vision, what they want in the future, and the whole nine yards. So it's great to see and hear that that's still out there and we can do this.
yeah, and some of it depends on, I mean, not all practices are created equal. And so there's buyers in the market that have an appetite depending on the size, the location, the type of office. Um, and so sometimes it's understanding what your options are first, and then you can kind of reverse engineer the transaction based on what you really want. Do you want to mentor younger dentists? Et cetera. So it can go a lot of different paths. Um, but the
So
small solar practitioner might not go to, like, a DSO may not want them. So even though they think that's where they have to sell, it's like that's not an option for you. So you need to realize that there's other stuff on the table. So
But that really isn't a last resort, the DSO situation. Oh, I guess I have to sell to an independent buyer because I'm not a candidate for a DSO. That's not really a last resort for a lot of practice owners. So I know there's so much out there with consolidation and DSOs and this magical timeline that you should really get in now for the best financial benefit. But what are you seeing? Are you still seeing a lot of independent transactions take place? And is independent dentistry gonna die?
yeah. So the short answer is no, independent dentistry is not going to die. Still 80% of our transactions are doctor to doctor, which, if you talk to a different broker, they may tell you 80% are DSO. But we find that most of the clients we talk to want to sell to another dentist. They just think they're leaving money on the table if they don't sell to corporate. And I'm going to say something probably controversial, but in most cases, the financial gain is not there in a DSO transaction. And people lose sight of the golden handcuffs that come with those type of transactions and the profit you lose during that period, as part of comparing a private sale versus a DSO.
Tell me more.
Like, I was gonna say, I'm like that. As soon as I said that, I'm like, I didn't give you enough there. That doesn't tell you the story. So, like, imagine you said, all right, January 1st, I'm going to sell to corporate. Well, they're going to require you to work for them for, let's say, 2 to 3 years minimum, right? They want you to be there as long as possible because that de-risks the deal for them. So on January 1st, today as an owner, you make X amount of dollars because you do the dentistry and you get to keep the profit. Well, on January 2nd, now you're a W-2 employee getting paid as an associate 35% of collections. And that profit that you were receiving now goes to the corporate entity, right? So if you just owned your practice for 3 more years, you would keep all of that profit for yourself, plus the tax shelters, plus the ability to, overfund your retirement through profit sharing and defined benefit plans, plus, plus, plus. And, that money usually surpasses or makes up for what the DSO is offering you in the sale price. So that's that opportunity cost that people don't take into their calculation, is that you're giving up multiple years of profit while you're in that, employee situation, making 35, 36, 38% of collections minus lab.
And
But
what about,
yeah, please go.
so, and what,
I know, hot
this is
topic.
fun, right? So what about, it feels to me like when we sell to a bigger group that maybe is VC backed, some of that money is up front, a lot of that money's later, and a lot of that later money is really not guaranteed money. So if what's the scoop there?
Yeah, well, so you're exactly right. The transactions are usually broken into 3 pieces. It's upfront cash. And what I usually tell sellers is that the amount you would get upfront from a corporate or DSO buyer is typically very close to what you would get on a doctor to doctor transaction, right? So let's assume your cash at close is similar. Then you're going to have that earnout piece, which is going to be tied to you sticking around for a period of time and maintaining the practice production and profit, right? They're willing to pay you that money because, listen, if I pay you 5 times EBITDA, which is 5 times profit, so I'm paying for 5 years of profit from you. If you're going to work 3 of them, I'm only at risk for 2, right? So that's how they de-risk that deal for themselves, is to have you stick around. Then that third component is the equity piece, which there have certainly been stories where the equity has worked out, and that if not, the DSO model wouldn't be attractive to people. But recently, there are less and less stories of DSO groups recapitalizing and exiting at the multiples they promised their sellers. And so that gets back to the point you're stating, which is, well, hey, I got, my practice does 3 million and the DSO offered me 8 million. Well, that equity projection they gave you in a PowerPoint isn't real money until they actually deliver on their recap plan. And with the challenges facing dentistry and the state of the market, to be fair to the DSOs, someone moved the goalposts in the last 24 months. So it's not entirely their fault that the market moved around them, and their model takes time to evolve to meet that. But that's the reality. And so that pot of gold at the end of the rainbow in the form of equity hasn't delivered more often than not in the last 24 months. And so now that big number you were promised is even less desirable because that equity piece is not there or never delivered. So that's the crux of the deal. So again, if I look at, I don't want to get into a math problem on a podcast because it can get hard to follow, but let's say, for example, I think you have to understand the difference between your compensation as the owner for doing dentistry and your profit. And sometimes doctors blend those 2 numbers and say, all right, I make 500,000 a year. Okay, you probably do, but 300 of that may be your W-2 wages for doing dentistry, and 200,000 is actually profit that the DSO is looking at. So when you give up that 200 because you're now an employee and you work for them for 5 years, well, that's $1 million that you left on the table that you could have kept for being an owner. And then you could have walked away, sold to someone and walked away in 6 months, right? And so there's that opportunity cost there of, okay, well, I'm $1 million short. But yeah, if you just owned your practice and continued to make that profit, you would net out the same. The asterisk out there is the equity. And if you talk to a DSO, they're going to tell you it's going to turn into $2 million. If you talk to other people, the answer might not always be the same. So I think that's the piece that everyone's either, leaning on heavily to justify taking the deal, or they may be regretting their decision because it didn't pan out the way they were promised it would. That was a long-winded response, but we're going down a path here that I could talk about for hours, I think. So.
Yeah, no, I'm here for this rabbit hole. So
Yeah.
what about So you're saying you can hang on for longer. You're now taking your normal pay plus your profit. And I think dentists are like, okay, yeah, no, 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 that sounds good. That makes sense. But what about those that are still kind of contemplating this DSO pie in the sky financial payout? Is there a demographic, whether it's the DSO or the practice themselves, that are more likely to experience this payout versus somebody else that's, maybe getting sold a bill of goods?
It's not necessarily practice specific on the seller side. It's more the DSO you partner with, right? And can they execute their vision for, acquiring practices and then either recapitalizing or selling to someone else. So it's really in your partner selection in terms of who you have buy the practice. Um, I think the most important thing that a DSO should be able to articulate to you or show you if you are going to lean heavily on the equity piece to justify the transaction is what is their organic growth at their locations that they've purchased, right? So I bought your practice. Have we been able to grow that location after acquiring it? And then I think more importantly, when the seller leaves, what happens, right? If the seller was there for 3 years and then they leave, do you all of a sudden have staff turnover and, turnover at the associate level, which leads to deterioration of EBITDA, deterioration of profit? That's what leads to challenges for these DSOs is because they're growing EBITDA through acquisition. But if you have a leaky bucket on the other end because the practices you acquire are deteriorating in profit because you've had associate turnover or the staffing challenges that every dentist is facing right now, that's a problem. And you're going to eventually run into a situation where you're chasing EBITDA to make up for your problems on the back end. And so, that's I think the biggest piece. If you're going to make a deal based on the equity conversion, the group you're partnering with better be great operators and really good at same store growth as you hear in the retail business.
Yeah, true. There's so much
Which
out
is
there. So what about your deal, Pam?
Oh, mine was interesting.
Yeah.
So when I bought my practice, it was from a general dentist who practiced uh, heavily restorative dentistry. She would look you in the eye and say she's a better prosthodontist than most prosthodontists out there. And solo practitioner, kind of small practice. And so I felt that that would be a good start for me. I worked in group practices and I worked in different types of settings, but I wasn't sure. I mean, number one, maybe I couldn't. Dave, I don't know, don't tell anybody. If I was even a candidate for taking out this crazy huge loan to buy this enormous practice. But for me, I felt like I was still juggling my time between teaching and practicing. And I felt that a small practice was the way to go. And my goal was to hopefully not have to move because I don't really enjoy really long commutes. So I was hoping to find a practice that would be, anywhere between, 45 minutes and less. And I found one that's less than 20 minutes away. So it was kind of perfect. And she practiced similarly to me. So it seemed like a pretty good deal. But then, which it was ultimately, because I've been able to grow the practice significantly since. But I remember distinctly having dinner with her the night of the closing, which don't do that, by the way, depending on your deal, but I did. And because not everybody, it's an emotional purchase, I mean, sale for the seller. So sometimes it's a happy emotion, sometimes it's a not happy emotion. In my case, it wasn't the happiest of emotions. So now we're at dinner. And she's not really thrilled that she let her practice go, but she needed to for personal reasons. And she wasn't happy with the check that she walked away with. So she basically, instead of, like you're saying, Dave, you take X number of dollars home every year, you take EBITDA home with you every year, and you walk away with a check, but that check maybe isn't representative of your quote unquote life's work, as she said. So dentists sometimes leave disappointed with the outcome. And so a DSO sale might not provide even more than that, would you say?
Yeah, I think that, you don't get rich selling your practice. You get rich by operating and owning a successful practice that you're happy running and that you can. So if you're hoping that at the end of your career, you know, you're going to feel this sense of like, all right, I sold and now that's the reward. I think you're right. I think it can be a little bit disappointing for people to say, oh, that's it. Like I put so much into this. That's why I think it's so important for these practice owners to, embrace the business now while they're in it and not, just worry about it at the end. Um,
So how do you work with like, how do you help them, your clients sort of like get that concept? Or,
yeah,
are you, when they say like, I want to sell this thing right now, like maybe you're not quite ready, or if you are ready, it looks like this.
yeah. I mean, it's not easy because some people, we have to have some really tough conversations sometimes. And ultimately it ends up in a better place. But we've taken a different approach to the valuation aspect. When I was working at the bank, Pam, we saw every appraisal out there, and I would get these 70-page documents, and they were very official, but probably cared about two of the pages. And it didn't really tell anything about why the value was there, or if you didn't like the value, how to make it better. And so we're lucky that we have, people within our organization that have experience to help dive into the practice and say, okay, here's your value today. And if you're thinking about selling in the next 5 years or 10 years or whatever it is, here's why it's there and what's holding you back. I mean, I'm sure you see it in your work all the time. A lot of times there's low hanging fruit. It's just a matter of like lack of oversight or lack of education on the staff side that can be easily fixed. And the practice is dramatically more profitable. Um, so we look at those low, like light lift, easier changes you can make. And then there's the more challenging things that are behavior change and trying to, change hygiene to embrace periodontal treatment and some of that stuff where it's like changing people behavior is very tough, but implementing a system or, you know, going through your outstanding claims and making sure the insurance pays them, like that stuff is just setting up a system and then doing it. It's not like hard. It's just time consuming or you need to make it a part of a process. So I think that's been our huge emphasis is you have to understand your value and you have to understand what it is from the different transition options that are out there between DSOs and private buyers and partnerships, et cetera. And then you have to understand how you can improve it and what it takes to get there. And, listen, some sellers just say, I get it, but I don't want to undertake that. That's a lot of work. The buyer can do that, which is fine. And we have other ones that have really embraced that. And we've seen the practices go from 1.5 to 2.2. A 1.5 practice that's worth 900 grand because there's little to no profit because they're overpaying their associates because they're paying them off gross production, or which is a real thing, to one that pays their associates appropriately, gets their hygiene schedule dialed in, and they're doing 2.2 and now it's worth 1.7. And that was a matter of 18 months. Just, to the work you do, Dave, the education piece is what they need the most, and someone to help them understand what's holding them back. So
I want to talk about the buyer for a second. So 80% of your transitions and transactions that you that you take part in are dentist to dentist. And so who are the buyers that you're seeing? So there's this, I guess, sentiment, David, would you agree out there that the younger dentist doesn't want to work necessarily in an independent practice because they have these inherent pressures to perform and get busy so that they can pay their loans. And because of this exorbitant loan, what do you call it? Loan debt, a debt that they have, that they carry, they might not be able to buy a practice down the road. And it's just not necessarily viable. And then obviously there's that whole generational comment that, people don't want to be stuck to the same location for a long time. So are you seeing your buyers to be, of the younger dentist demographic, Or are these dentists that are looking to, accumulate multiple locations?
It's both, but there are more younger dentists that want to own than you may think. And I don't necessarily know that it's just the student loan burden. I think the one huge difference between the dental market now and the dental market, I would argue even 10 years ago, is that the associate dentist that wants to buy a practice has better options than they used to, right? Before it was like, I'll buy anything because I'm working for another dentist and my chair is never full. He gets all the good cases. I'm getting all the leftovers and I'm only making X. And so I would buy almost any practice because now I can have a full schedule, which I couldn't get before. And plus I'm going to get profit and I get to own my own business, et cetera. Now they can work and be the full-time dentist at a practice making 250, 300 grand potentially and not have any of the headaches. So I think that I don't know that it's necessarily like, hey, it's just the student loan burden. I think a lot of them are more selective and they have this option to earn a really good income without the headaches that maybe wasn't always there in the past because it was mostly working for someone else that owned the business. So those we still see a lot of young dentists that are very anxious and eager to get into ownership. And there's plenty out there that don't, but I think that's always existed. It's just more pronounced because of some of the alternative options out there that didn't exist 10 years ago.
We're seeing, Pam, and Dave, we're seeing it's about the 2.5 year mark that most of the young dentists come to us, and they're, for all the reasons, saying like, I'm ready now. And whether they work for you or for myself, or they work for a DSO, they're thinking, I've learned enough. I see how hard I am working. I'd like more control. I'd like to make more money. I'd like to be in charge of my destiny. So I would agree with that, Deb. I think, there's always going to be people who don't want to buy, but I feel like our industry has done a good job of selling that story, and that maybe isn't the real story. It's just
Yes,
marketed very well.
100%. I get so frustrated when I hear people say, oh, well, none of these young doctors can afford to buy a practice with the student loans. There are more dental specific lenders in the space today than
Yeah.
there have ever been, and they
Yep.
will loan money more than they would in the past. So, if anything, the access to capital has gotten easier for these younger
Yeah.
dentists despite the student loan debt. So, yeah, hearing that out there every time I want to scream because I'm like, that's not a reason. Um, you know, there are plenty of young dentists that, to your point, have either said, all right, I came out, I did the corporate thing because they gave me a great offer and they were in my school and it seemed like it was going to be fantastic, but I don't want that. I don't want the factory style dentistry. I want to be in a community. I want to build relationships with my patients. I want to do treatment planning, not just what I have to do to hit a goal. And so those doctors are still, again, out there, and we have more buyers than we do sellers in almost all of the markets. So it's not a buyer shortage problem at all. So
Wow. I also want to ask you, you mentioned earlier about associate pay, something that's appropriate, that's not going to destroy your practice. What percentage is an appropriate pay? I think a lot of dentists either almost let the associate dictate what they are, what they want because you want to find somebody quality. But I think at the same time, you have to keep your business in mind. So I just kind of want you to put it out there. Like what should be considered in line for appropriate?
well, and this is regional too. So I will say we're in New England. So this is the Northeast market because the Midwest is very different. And same with the West Coast, et cetera. But for the Northeast market in New England, we see that most people around 35% of adjusted production or adjusted collections, right? 35% less a percentage of lab. And we can certainly see that go up to 38% in certain areas. And this is for general practitioners. But that's the range that we're seeing as market, and what most buyers, like another place to check is buyers that are employing sellers, they're starting at that number. So
Yeah.
All right. I think that's a great number. Absolutely.
mhm. Yeah. Um, well, and I just think that a lot of times it's we'll talk to sellers who are 2 or 3 years out, and they're worried that if they don't sell now, they won't be able to find a buyer. And they're like, I don't want to be stuck in 2 or 3 years with my practice and no one will buy it and I want to retire. And that certainly could be the case, but I think it just all goes back to, if you want to sell to another dentist, which I feel like most providers do if the money was equal, right? If you said it's the exact same dollar amount that you're going to net from your sale, who would you prefer to sell to? I think the overwhelming majority would say, I want to sell to another dentist. And so, with that in mind, you can do it if you just plan a little bit ahead. I mean, if you're within an hour of Boston, you could say, I want to sell my practice in 60 days, and you could do it. If you're in northern New Hampshire, upstate New York, Western Mass, Vermont, different areas where the buyer pool might not be as huge, then you just have to plan a little bit further out. Maybe it's an associate to ownership path. Maybe it's just understanding that I want to be done doing dentistry with my hands in 2 or 3 years. And based on my location, maybe I have to be willing to put it on the market earlier and try and have time to find a buyer. So I think it all just comes back to putting a plan together around the transition to find that person, instead of just, being reactive and kind of almost like feeling like you're on the defense of like, oh, I'm selling because if I don't, I'm going to lose somehow.
I think that's a really good point. I feel like if we as dentists who are thinking we're wanting to sell, the best thing we can do is, reach out to you sooner, get educated, build a plan. Even if the plan isn't right now, the plan is 6 months from now, a year from now, or 2 years from now. I think just to know based on where we are and what our goals are and what we're willing to accept and not accept it. It just feels being proactive is so much more helpful.
Well, and like we have the sad circumstance of like someone passes unexpectedly, right? And there's no plan or estate and the practice value goes away. Like we tell doctors all the time, even if you're 20 years away from retiring, you should have like like we call it a rapid sale plan in our business. Like we have a worksheet that we send to people for free, because that will, if God forbid something happens, you have a toolkit for your significant other or spouse or whoever's in charge of the estate to execute, to try and get a plan done. And that exercise alone will at least make you think about it, right? Like you don't have to get a value, you don't have to think about selling and put on the market, but God forbid something were to happen, like who's going to help pull this all together for you in an emergency? So I think it's just all around that planning of protecting the asset, both in the event of like a disaster, but also, all right, let's look at my timeline and when we need to start putting the wheels in motion.
I think it's
100%.
also interesting from the buyer's perspective. I think people think of practice brokers as somebody who, quote unquote, works for the seller. And so I think if you're looking to buy a practice, it's probably worth giving you a call too, right? I feel like it's not just for the seller for you to magically find somebody. I think buyers should probably consider reaching out too.
Yeah, I think, we encourage people to get in our database and we provide resources, because at the end of the day, we tell like our piece is it's a math problem. And so from there, then it's about clinical fit and, the practice, kind of personality and what that culture is and what type of dentistry the buyer does compared to the seller. So it's very important for buyers to get engaged with brokers or just people in this world so they can start to learn what the process is and what to expect and get on the list so that if something comes available in their market, they can find it. And because it's really competitive, as we talked about, there's a lot of buyers. So you want to make sure you can, you're educated and can move through the process quickly if you want to buy your first practice.
Is buying your
100%.
first practice the same as buying your second versus buying your third?
It's the process. It's overwhelming. I don't want to like hide from the fact that it's really hard to buy a practice. I think some people are shocked. They love the idea of ownership, but when they understand it's actually more work than their associate job, they might pump the brakes a little bit. But I think buying the first one, you got to find your accountant, you need an attorney to help you. And you're going through this whole process for maybe the first and only time. I mean, Pam, you went through it, right? It's like it's like drinking from a fire hose. You're trying to figure out this whole process in a span of 30 or 60 days, and then all of a sudden you're an owner. So having resources and advisors and going to educational events where you can learn about this, anything to become more well equipped when the process actually starts is going to give you an advantage over the other buyers, right? Because you're more educated, you're more qualified, you can move through the process more efficiently, and it's going to give you more confidence so that when it comes time to make crucial decisions, you feel like you're making them from a place of knowledge and education, and not just leaning on an advisor you just met 3 days ago.
True story. So, okay, if I'm a buyer, a potential buyer, or a potential seller, what do I do next to reach out to you, to make the connection, to say, you know what, I get it. I definitely want to get out there and figure out my game plan and not have to wing this thing. What's the best way for people to reach you?
Yeah, so our website is rosendentaltransitions.com. And so we have a ton of free resources on there, a lot of different webinars, toolkits, that rapid sale plan. So if you don't have an estate plan for your practice, it's a free Word doc you can download to put that together. And then for buyers, going to that same website, because then you can register as a buyer to be alerted for new listings. Also, again, a lot of educational content on there. On LinkedIn as well. So you can find me at, David Miller at Rosen Dental Transitions, or you can just send us an email, D Miller. So D as in Dave, D Miller at rosendentaltransitions with an S.com. So
fantastic. Pam, again, here we are.
I know, it's insane how quickly the time goes, especially when I feel like there's so much more to ask. There really is, from a buyer's perspective, seller's perspective. But I do appreciate you, though, for bringing light to this whole, like you said, this is being sold right now and what's going on in dentistry. And I think it's freaking a lot of dentists out. So thanks for giving us hope that what we're doing as independent practices isn't going anywhere, at least anytime in the foreseeable future. So Dave, thank you so much for your time and your expertise today.
Thank you both for having me. This was a blast. And there's more to talk about. So maybe we'll do part 2. We'll have another episode on our podcast, Pam. We'll have you on. So
oh my
you
gosh.
and David on as guests.
Awesome.
Thank you. Vice versa. So you've heard it here. Look out for part 2. All right, everybody, for Dentistry Unmasked, we will see you all next week. Bye.
Bye, guys. Thank you, everyone, for watching or listening to the show this week. And thanks to our guests and sponsors on this episode.
Please check out our social media at Dr. Pamela_Maragliano and at Dental Economics Official.
Or you can check me out at Ignite DDS or at Dr. David Rice.
And go to dentaleconomics.com to receive dental economics. You can choose to receive DE in print or digitally, and you can also get the details of our Principles of Practice Management conference on our website.
If you have topics or guests or anything you'd like to talk about on the show, send us an email to dentistryunmaskedpodcast@gmail.com, and we will do our very best to make it happen. Thanks again, and we'll see you next week.